What's happening, Mississippi? From MPB Think Radio, this is a sit down with Russ Latino, where we explore the ideas and people that are shaping Mississippi's future. We've got borders and tariffs and Doge, oh my. Lots going on in the world. Big speech last night to Congress. We're going to dig into it. We want to hear from you today. Germaine, what's the call-in number one more time?
All right. So if you want to join today's conversation, it's going to be 1-877-MPB-RING. That's 1-877-672-7464. We want you to call, or you can send an email to the sitdown@mpbonline.org.
Yeah, let us know what you thought about last night's speech. Obviously, depending on your politics, you might have loved it, you might have not liked it, you might have decided to watch something else because it was long. It was long. It was very long.
Yes.
We're going to dig into it, maybe explore some of the bigger topics today. And then also, before we get there, though, just want to mention that yesterday was a really big day in the legislature. So a little closer to home, the legislature operates on deadlines, right? Every single thing that happens, all the pressure that builds during session relates to certain deadlines. Yesterday was the deadline for the Senate to take up House bills and move them out of committee, and for the House to take up Senate bills and move them out of committee. It is generally a day of great bloodletting, Germaine. More things die than live. And we saw a lot of that yesterday.
Yeah.
The House had a slate of education reform proposals that were oriented around school choice. One of those would have made it a little bit easier for public-to-public transfers for students. Essentially, what it did was remove the veto power of the school that the student was leaving. That died in the Senate yesterday. The House also passed something called the Tim Tebow Act, related to the quarterback from back in the day at Florida. Tebow in Florida was a homeschooler, but was able to play high school sports with his public school. That bill would have allowed homeschoolers to participate in extracurricular activities at the public school where they live. That died yesterday. And then there was a bill yesterday that would have allowed for public charter schools to open up in C districts, and that died yesterday. On the other end of the hall, and I can't go through all of it because it would take us literally all day and then some.
But at least you know all of it off top, Russ.
Well, I mean, look, there are advantages and extreme disadvantages to being a policy nerd. I'll just say that. But one of them is that I do follow this stuff. I will mention, because we talked about this last week, and I think maybe in the week before, too, the idea that there was going to be election reform where municipal candidates might have to also file campaign finance reports and that sort of thing online so that people could see it through the Secretary of State. The Senate had passed that bill. The House killed it yesterday. I don't really understand why, but
that happened.
You know, because at some level it just seems to make sense from a transparency standpoint that regardless of whether or not you think one mayor is good or bad or whatever, it just makes sense for the public to be able to see that, know where their money's coming from, know how they're spending it.
I like that.
But, it didn't make it. Election reforms are really hard. I mean, our election code is a clumsy mess, and that's probably an insult to clumsy messes everywhere. But I will tell you, for whatever reason, there's always resistance in the legislature to anything that would clean the code up a little bit. I will say, there was a kerfuffle a few weeks ago about early voting. The Senate passed an early voting bill. That bill moved to the House, but the House essentially stripped out that language and instead created some new conditions for absentee voting. It seems at some level like wordplay or semantics because, in effect, our absentee voting laws are operating like early voting laws. Like, people have to say the reason they're not voting.
Right, and then you get
presumably,
and then you get to vote.
And then you get to mail in a ballot.
Yeah.
The early voting bill that passed out of the Senate was in person. But it would allow for early voting leading up to the election. Anyway, all that stuff remains to be seen. We've got a big tax bill that remains to be seen what happens with it. Both the Senate and House have their own versions. I think that's probably the biggest political football of this session, and is probably a reason that some stuff is going to die as horse trading occurs.
Yeah.
And it may also be the reason that a couple things live as horse trading occurs around that bill. Still a big bill around whether or not to create a fifth tier of PERS, which is the public retirement system. There's been a lot of conversation around what to do for new employees coming into state work. And so that's still alive. Lots of big conversations happening. we'll see how it all unfolds. But at least wanted to give you a rundown that some important stuff happened yesterday.
I'm kind of intrigued about that 5th tier PERS one, though.
Well, you want to talk about it for a second?
Yeah, let's do that because I want to know about that new. Is it like a new retirement tier? Is it what we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, currently there are 4 tiers.
Okay.
Right, just depending on when changes were made, different benefits were added. Different retirement dates occurred, as changes have happened over time.
Yeah.
This would be to create a new tier specifically for new employees coming into the system.
Okay.
And part of the thought process is that if you look at trend lines, people are not staying in government jobs as long as they used to. And so for a new employee, the allure of public retirement is not as strong.
Right.
Because a huge percentage of them will never serve enough time
That 30.
to vest.
Yeah, or the vesting time.
To even vest.
Correct.
Right. And so there is some thought, one, how do we make the system more solvent moving forward? Because we currently have a $25 billion unfunded liability for Mississippi PERS. And so some of that is making sure that problem doesn't get worse.
Right.
But then there's also the thought, I think, that, hey, for new employees, it's not the same incentive as it used to be. The retirement is not the same incentive. So can we create something that looks a little bit more like their pattern? A lot of debate on that issue. It's like,
What were they proposing, Russ?
So essentially what they're proposing is a shorter vesting period. And then there's been some conversation, and we'll see what ultimately comes out of this, but there's been some conversation essentially where a person might have the option of either doing a defined benefit plan or a defined contribution plan. Really the difference between a typical pension or a 401k is what we're talking about. So all of that stuff's up in the air. There's a lot of conversation. The vehicle is still alive.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately like so many other things in politics at Mississippi level and national level is that it's very hard to have rational conversation around how to fix what are real problems because there's a tendency on both sides to either blow up how good the solution is or to blow up how bad the proposed solution is.
Yeah, of course.
And it's like, well, hey, what if we started from a recognition that we've got a problem, that the way that people work is changing, and how do we craft something so that at the end of the day, current retirees and people who have vested don't feel like what's been promised to them is in jeopardy.
Correct.
And simultaneously, we've designed a system where we actually are solvent enough to make sure we honor all those promises at the same time that we're recruiting new talent. You know this as well as anybody. In state government right now, if you go and talk to any agency head, they will tell you the hardest problem they've got is acquiring new talent.
Yeah.
Right? Some of that is how do we compete with private sector wages? Some of it, though, is a byproduct of the fact that the benefits aren't the same level of enticement that they used to be. And so, as an example, currently, let's say you've got 19%, give or take, that the state is paying on behalf of the employee, and then another 9% that the employee contributes to their own retirement. So, close to 27%, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at that, if you're a new employee and you know you will never vest, then really what you're looking at with that 27% is a suppression of your wages. You're looking at it going, I could be making 27% more, knowing that I'm never going to take up all those retirement.
Right.
So those are the kinds of conversations that if we had a rational playing field with people who could sit down in a room and do a little math together, we might get somewhere, but that's not the world we live in.
Well, let me tell you, side note, when it came down to my, what I'd call vestation day is I had a baby.
It's like coronation day.
I know, and I had a baby party that day on the 8th year.
There you go.
I did.
I almost started singing a song from Frozen. The Coronation Day song?
Oh, was it? Oh,
anybody?
Now
no?
You know you've got kids.
I've got a 10-year-old little girl who was like toddler age when that movie came out.
Kids.
My gosh, we watched the heck out of some Frozen.
Right.
Did you watch the speech last night?
I did. I actually held it down here at the station. So I was here for the entire 2.5 hours.
Were you giving color commentary?
No, we make sure that it gets on clean and clear. We make sure that everything's there, and then we pull it right off. We pull it right off after it's done.
Okay.
But I was here for it.
I didn't know. I've noticed now I scroll on social media sometimes because who doesn't?
Yeah.
And there are now these reaction video things. Right, where it's
I hadn't gotten up this morning and gotten on social this morning.
Well, and not just to Trump, like just generally. It'd be like somebody's talking and another guy's in the corner of the video just nodding his head.
Let me tell you
or
about
laughing
those.
or making faces.
I do not like those, Russ. I do not like those videos. Sam, I am.
It feels like they're just stealing someone else's material.
Well, it's almost like, do you want me to watch you or do you want me to watch the content? And I'm confused.
Well, if you watched the Trump speech last night, a few thoughts. I mean, one, no matter what you think of President Trump, he is a master marketer. He is so good at marketing and knowing when to pick moments and knowing who to call out in the audience. I mean, all presidents do that.
Correct.
But look, the idea of bringing a 13-year-old child who is dealing with brain cancer and giving him a Secret Service agent pass, that is brilliant level marketing. Right. And I don't say that to diminish sort of the value of it. I'm just saying, like, in the grand scheme of things, that's brilliant. He's also very funny. Like, and I know not everybody thinks he's funny.
No, there's people who do.
But he is also very funny. And he has stamina unlike any human being I have ever seen.
Well, I have to agree there.
I mean, yeah. Well, look, I mean, just let me say why I'm saying he's funny.
And before we go to break two, I want you to say that.
Sure. So, and there are lots of points I could point out, but I'll give you an example. So, Bill Barr, who was his attorney general, famously disagreed with him on whether or not the 2020 presidential election had been stolen. At some point in the 2024 election, comes out and basically endorses President Trump for re-election, despite the dispute that they had in 2020.
Yeah.
And Trump tweets something along, or Truth Social or whatever it is, along the lines of, I have previously called Bill Barr, and it's like a litany of insults.
Correct.
Just a litany of insults. And then he says, and now he has endorsed me. I removed from my previous list.
He didn't struck it from the record.
Just one word, the word lethargic. So he kept everything else. And I'm sorry. Yes, that is somewhat mean.
But I want you to know.
But that is objectively funny.
And he's the only one writing that. He's the only one writing that.
Do you not think
Russ.
That's true?
I know. But I know.
Yeah.
He's the only one writing it.
I think he is writing it.
I know it. I know he is.
And then, my Lord, the stamina to stand there for an hour and 40 minutes, the longest speech ever delivered to a joint session of Congress, was the speech he delivered. When we come back from break, we'll dig into what he said. You're listening to Sit Down with Russ Latino. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Desiree Frazier, host of the award-winning news program, Mississippi Edition. We bring you conversations about the latest news from across the Magnolia State. Whether it's politics, healthcare, or education, you'll hear in-depth discussions on issues that matter to you. So join us each weekday morning at 8:30 on MPB Think Radio, or download the podcast, listen through the app, and online.
Both seasons of the 10-Minute Timeout are now available on a variety of podcasting apps. The mini podcast can be binged in a day and is perfect for those that just want a quick listen. Join me, Lacey Alexander, as I sit down with special guests, revisit major moments, and give a platform to the athletes and sports that shape Mississippi. Head over to mpbonline.org to give it a try.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bobby Rush. As a blues man, I love Mississippi Public Broadcasting. If you support Mississippi music and their local programming, donate now, right now. and become a member today, not tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Doesn't matter how big or small, but we prefer big. Thank you very much.
You're listening to The Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. We're talking today about the presidential address to Congress last night. A lot of people have been calling it the State of the Union. It was not, in fact, the State of the Union. Just a cool 1 hour and 40-minute rap session with our president, Donald Trump.
That's right.
President Trump evokes very strong emotions across the spectrum, right? There are people who are extremely loyal and have fealty towards the president, and there are people who really don't like him very much. And some of those people in both camps were in the chamber last night. Another somewhat unusual moment at the beginning of that speech was that obviously there was a little bit of heckling.
Yes.
Sort of British Parliament style, not something we're accustomed to seeing necessarily in the U.S. Marjorie Taylor Greene did it a few years ago with Biden. Joe Wilson did it a few years before that with President Obama. Last night, it felt like the initial wave of heckling was like everybody on the Democratic side. One representative was escorted out of the chamber, which I've never seen in American politics.
Representative Al Green.
Representative Al Green was escorted out of the chamber after he refused a couple of orders to sit down. And then others got up and left throughout the course of the ceremony. Here's what I would say, and if you were to go back and look at my social media, you would see that I said the same thing about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Joe Wilson. I do think that there is something to American politics and sort of good form in American politics where even when you disagree with the president, there's a need to be respectful of the office of the presidency. And so I looked at what happened last night and thought this actually plays into President Trump's hands and the Republican Party's hands at some level, because I think most Americans watching that sort of thing just expect some level of decorum in the same way that I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Joe Wilson hurt the Republican Party back when they heckled Biden and Obama.
Do you think the level of decorum just in general has somewhat just gone out the window? When it comes down to that, I mean, from what we knew too, I mean, you and I are somewhat around the same age of what politics
you're younger than I am, but you're so sweet.
Of what politics were, though, back when we were young, and it didn't sound like this. This is a new sound. Do you think that idea of decorum is now kind of died?
It's certainly on life support.
But I think from both sides, I think once they always say, don't hit first until somebody hits you. And so I think once the hits have started, now it's like, just all of the decorum has gone out the window.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to, you could have this conversation, I think, around like, say, judicial nominations as an example. Mm-hmm. And there was a ratcheting up in the Senate as to how they dealt with judicial nominations. It used to be, Antonin Scalia got 97 Senate votes for confirmation, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think, had 98 or 99, right?
Yeah.
So it used to not be this sort of hyper-partisan environment. And then certain procedural rules changed over time. One party would do one thing, the next party would up it, And this is one of the general lessons that I think people should learn about executive power is like if you look at the number of executive orders that have amassed over time, it used to be that presidents entered very few executive orders.
Right.
It now looks like they're governing increasingly. Every administration is governing with more executive orders. And at some level, you just got to be aware that once you break the institution, once you start to say, hey, we've always done it this way, but now we're going to do a little bit different, you've got to assume that eventually your political opponent will have the same power. You will lose, they will come in, and they will have that same power.
Yeah.
Right? So at some level, where Russ is I'd much rather people be restrained because whether it's my guy or somebody else's guy,
right.
I know at some point pendulum swing.
Right.
And if power is getting abused now, it will get abused later.
Yeah.
And so to come back around to your question, yes, I absolutely believe that both sides, and I hate the term both sides, because I think there are lots of different people with very different ideas, and we try to squeeze them into one camp or the other camp. But I think decorum and civility have been lost in conversation in a way that is detrimental long term. One, to us living together in a happy, harmonious way, and two, to us finding solutions to problems. And so I didn't like what I saw last night in terms of the response to the president, but I understand the point of view that says, hey, look, we're living in an environment where your old stodgy boomer self, I'm not a boomer.
No, but just in my opinion too, my brain always goes back to, and not, again, I like that. I like what you said where you're not splitting the two sides, but my brain does go back to the riot on the Capitol January 6th as the closest kind of wild event that happened that kind of shifted the pendulum, I guess, as to what decorum looks like, and then as to the response to some of that, whether it had been positive to the riot or whether it had been negative to the riot, kind of helped build some of this landscape that we're now sitting in. So it's like, again, like I say, if you, once you're hit, you feel like you need to hit back.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a really long conversation for maybe another day, because I do think people fundamentally see January 6th very differently, and you see that now, right? And in terms of, there's a sort of diametric divide as to what that really was and whether it was overplayed or underplayed. And, I think a lot of that depends on your camp, what you think about those things. That being said, I think some of the fabric of society, whether you're talking about January 6th, whether you're talking about some of the riots that have occurred outside of the Washington, D.C., it shows an unraveling of social trust, right? Like, people are not trusting each other to do what is right. People are assuming that if someone else has a different point of view, that it's not just that they have a different point of view, that they are actually evil or bad or come from it in a negative way. And I think when you have that, when you have the breakdown of faith in institutions, whether it's Congress or the Supreme Court or the press, all of those things contribute to the environment we're in, where people feel like there's no trust. Yeah. And candidly, each side feels like they're losing.
Yeah.
Right?
I feel like the trickle down is trickling up. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like a trickle down, trickle up situation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But you've got a scenario where if you were to go and talk to Republicans right now, a lot of them would say, well, we've been losing for so long, right? And if you went to talk to Democrats, a lot of them would say the exact same thing, so that each side feels like the other is imposing upon them, and each side feels like they're losing and they're fighting for ground. And I think that's an environment that makes it very hard for us to have decorum and civility and good solutions. I will say this before we go to another break, which I guess is coming up.
And then I want to get into some
let's actually get into the details, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I will say just one detail that I think that probably resonates with a lot of American people. I mean, one, he did start very positively. The first part of the speech was a conversation about reinvigorating the American dream and the American spirit and all of this. And I think that stuff resonates with people. I think one policy point that resonates, if you look at polling, is around the border, right? And certainly there's a lot of different conversation around how to treat people who are in this country in violation of the law, and what that looks like, what it looks like to be humane. All of those are good conversations. Overwhelmingly, Americans want the border to be secure. Regardless of what happens with our immigration policy moving forward, they want to know that the border is secure. And I can't really explain this other than to say that last February there were 130,000 encounters with illegal border crossings by border agents. This month there were 8,000.
Right.
It has been a precipitous decline in illegal border crossings. And as near as I can tell, the best explanation for it is people realize that he means business. Yeah. And have just stopped trying.
Right.
Which, if you're an American that is concerned about the security of the border, I think that's a win for President Trump. We'll talk more about some of the other things that he talked about when we come back from break. You're listening to The Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio with Russ Latino. We'll be right back.
The Measuring Show.
Since 1970, MPB has been enriching the lives of Mississippians.
Everything we do gives us the chance to grow and learn.
With your support, we are always there whenever and wherever you need us. Together through the years, together in the future. Please consider making a donation at mpbfoundation.org. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Both seasons of the 10-Minute Timeout are now available on a variety of podcasting apps. The mini podcast can be binged in a day and is perfect for those that just want a quick listen. Join me, Lacey Alexander, as I sit down with special guests, revisit major moments, and give a platform to the athletes and sports that shape Mississippi. Head over to mpbonline.org to give it a try.
What's happening at the Mississippi Legislature? Tune in to MPB's At Issue for an inside look at the legislative session, interviews with legislators, and perspectives from both sides of the aisle. I'm your host, Wilson Stribling. At Issue airs every Friday night at 6:30 on MPB Think Radio throughout the session. You can also subscribe to the MPB At Issue podcast and catch At Issue videos on YouTube and at mpbonline.org. MPB's At Issue. Tune in, Mississippi.
Listening to The Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. We're talking about the president's address last night. A lot of big issues. Obviously, an hour and 40-minute long speech, breaking Bill Clinton's previous record for longest speech to a joint session of Congress, at least in modern times. I like to think that at some point, William Henry, no, he died too early. Let's see. James Madison went and gave a really long speech, or Garfield gave a really long speech, and we just don't know about it. But anyway, it was long, covered a lot of stuff. Let's talk about some of the specifics. We talked a little bit about the border policy. I actually think that's a win for the president. I think that's something that resonates with a lot of voters. I think some of the other areas also are potentially wins. There are things that I look at as a guy who grew up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. I look at the Gulf of America conversation at some level, and it feels hokey.
Kind of trivial.
For lack of
And look, if I want everybody to know, you can still call in. Make sure you join today's conversation. If you've got any kind of comment about any of this, 1-877-MPB-RING. That's 1-877-672-7464.
You're so much better at that than I am. So, what I'm saying is, though, I think it's a little hokey, but I think the average American kind of thinks it's cool. And so at some level, some of the stuff that he's doing is not necessarily stuff that that appeals to everybody, but I think it appeals to broad swaths. He talked about tax policy last night. I think there's been a lot of confusion around what the House budget plan really did. There's been a conversation that the House passed trillions of dollars in new tax cuts. That's a little misleading. So what really is happening right now around tax policy is that you've got the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act was drafted in a way that it expires this year. And so what the House essentially did was to say, we're going to extend the existing tax rates. It's not a new cut so much as it is in some ways the prevention of tax increases. Now, you can either agree with that or disagree with it. But I think that's an important distinction, is what's really being talked about. The bulk of the tax policy is really just an extension of current rates. And if they do nothing, then across the board, from lowest income levels to highest income levels, tax rates are going up. Thomas and Rolling Fork, what's going on, man?
Great show today.
Thank you, sir.
I wanted to echo your comments about Americans wanting the president to be presidential and for there to be decorum in Congress and in politics. And I think that we all need to take a step back and step away from this almost populism that we have now and realize that, Trump is not infallible. And almost like the people that make excuses for him embolden him and push us to an area that we don't need to go. Is there ever a chance you think that that he'll calm down and we can get back to politics as usual?
Calm down is an interesting thing to think about. I think he's himself, right? It's sort of the Popeye mode where he is what he is. Some people love that. Some people don't love that. I think at some level, it's not so much him, right? Because like I said, I don't think he's going to change his stripes. I think it's other people who are willing to look at whether it's a Republican president or a Democrat president, Thomas, and say, hey, I'm a Republican and Donald Trump is a Republican president, but that doesn't mean that I have to accept everything he says as if it's true. It doesn't mean that I have to surrender my own disbelief, the questions that I've had, things that I've believed for a while that now the party is shifting away from. And I would say the exact same thing if we were talking about a Democratic president, right? I think it is folly for any human to follow another person without question, right? Short of Jesus Christ, this is Russ's view, short of Jesus Christ, there has never been a perfect human being to walk on this planet. And so I'm not going to start by thinking that Donald Trump or Barack Obama or anybody in between can be that. All of us are fallible human beings, and that means that all of us should exercise independent judgment when we're looking at the policies that are being put in front of us. Thomas, great call. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Kay in Madison?
Give it 1 second, Russ. She hasn't totally loaded in yet.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Give it 1 second.
Well, let me say this while we wait for this call to get loaded. One of the other big issues that was discussed last night is Doge. Obviously the call there for Elon Musk is to try and figure out ways to identify government waste and abuse and reduce spending. I will say this as a guy who is conservative. Nothing pleases me more than the thought of how do we right-size government? How do we make sure that we're spending at appropriate levels on core functions and not drowning out or boxing out the private sector economy? I am worried about our current spending levels, deeply worried about our current spending levels, and have been for a number of years. That being said, everything that the president listed off last night was ridiculous, right? And I don't mean that he was being ridiculous. The spending that he identified is ridiculous spending. And he got raucous applause from Congress in response to him identifying those ridiculous elements of spending. Two thoughts. One, as ridiculous as they are, they don't add up to very much. We're talking about trillions of dollars in deficit, and he was talking in the millions, and in some case, the very, very low billions. I'm not saying we shouldn't care about that. I'm saying that doesn't fix the budget. The other thing that I would say is that everyone who was applauding the recognition of those things yesterday voted for those things. They all voted on spending bills that included those things. And so there's a certain degree of disconnect or irony, however you want to put it, in the idea that the people who voted to allow that spending are now extremely excited at the thought of gutting it. Fine. You should have never voted for it in the first place. So that's my only beef there. Let's see. Kay in Madison, how are you?
How are you?
I'm doing well.
Great. Really enjoying the topic today, and it's kind of refreshing to hear people, a little disgruntled, a little, unhappy about the situation. I just want to get your opinion on two things, which is one is I feel like during the election, a lot of the people who were supporters, especially non-MAGA Republicans, like just Republicans who are Republicans because they are, and may not have been so thrilled about, some of the things that they heard, but they were just Republicans because they are. I feel like if more people who were in that line would have said something, would have said, we're still supporting you, but we can't get behind that. I feel like maybe we wouldn't be so far in the trenches with these questionable cabinet picks, with this kind of all out, czar that we have now. Why do you think that is? Why do you think, regular, people wouldn't speak up and say, you're still our leader, but we want to see more leadership? Like, why is that? And then secondarily, given that there's Republican, majority in the House, and then we don't have enough for a filibuster in the Senate, why do you think we couldn't have just picked in my opinion, a more superior candidate and then hold that candidate accountable? Because Democrats are more amenable to concessions and are more amenable to making concessions to kind of make Republicans happy. Like, why do you think people were so gung-ho on getting that particular person when there seem to be better options either in, holding Democrats accountable or forcing your candidate to be a better person?
Okay, that's a lot. I don't know that I remember every single one of your questions.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm glad you expressed your thoughts on that. I would say that I'm not disgruntled, first of all. Maybe that makes me gruntled. I don't know exactly what that means. But so I look at it like this. There are things that President Trump is proposing that I very much agree with. I think we should extend the current tax scheme, candidly, because not doing that results in the largest tax increase in U.S. history on people who are already struggling to make ends meet, put groceries on the table.
Right.
So I would look at that and say that's a positive. I would look at what's going on along the border and say that's a positive. Now, I would caveat that by saying at some level, I think we should be more humane when we're having conversations about people who want to come to our country in pursuit of a better life, to take care of their family, to have opportunity. And that we need to think about how do we modernize our immigration system in a way that allows more people who want to contribute into the system. And so there are things like that I point out and say, I think he's doing a good job. I think the focus on how do we right-size government is an important focus. I think the question that I've got there is whether or not what they're currently doing is going to be enough, or if it's chaotic in a way that actually sets us back from having a conversation about what government should be doing. So there are things like that. And look, I would say tariffs as an example is something that I would look at and say, I think tariffs are the wrong policy. And so I would say that both sides at some level in recent years have become increasingly tribal in a way that is not good, because it allows us to stop thinking for ourselves. And the goal should be for us to think for ourselves. Great call. Appreciate it. We've got a couple more calls on the line. Bill in Biloxi, how are you?
How about you?
Doing well.
Look, I'm concerned, similar to what the last caller talked about. This whole notion of we're going to take whatever the president says, and we know it's wrong. Things like, okay, the president says Ukraine started the war. Since when does a person who's not invading start the war? Russia invaded? Pure and simple. I get concerned about that. I get concerned when we start, denouncing our friends and loving up on our enemies like they are our best, buddy in the world. Putin is a killer. Russia has been the enemy of the United States since there was a Russia. At the end of the day, we need to be able to stand up. And I'm amazed that the Republican Party cannot just say, Mr. President, you're mistaken. Putin started the war. Why are we dropping our guards when the president stops our cyber attacks on Russia, and they are opening up more cyber attacks on us?
So
this is just confusing to me.
No, and I appreciate your question or your thought. What I would say is, I think 100% that Russia invaded Ukraine, that Russia is responsible for starting this war, that Vladimir Putin is a dictator who has killed his political opponents, poisoned them, put dissidents in prison, exiled other dissidents. So there is a track record there of him not being a good guy, being incredibly aggressive. The only sort of devil's advocate that I'll play with you is this, is I thought that the meeting in the Oval Office could not have gone worse for the U.S. or for Ukraine. In that, I've practiced law, Bill, for 10 years, and I've been recovering for the last 14. So what I will tell you is, when you get close to a settlement deal, the thing that is most likely to blow up a settlement deal is when you start to relitigate who was right and who was wrong. And so I think Zelensky walked into a trap by trying to relitigate that. But I also think that there's some merit to this idea that we should remember that ultimately Putin can't be trusted. And by the way, Republicans overwhelmingly in polling still say that Putin can't be trusted, right? So it's not so much that I think the Republican Party has started to believe that Putin is a good guy. I think it's a question of how do you get to peace, right? How do you stop the meat grinder that's occurring in Ukraine? And to his credit, perhaps, we'll see how it plays out. What you see is Zelensky coming back to the table, Zelensky saying that he regretted the way that meeting went down, and Zelensky saying that he's ready to make a deal. There's an argument to be said that even if we don't like the tactics, even if we have problem with the idea of calling someone who was invaded, a dictator or the aggressor or whatever, at some level, if the end result is peace, then there's some value in that. There's some obvious value in that. And so I think that's what people are trying to struggle with or grapple with as we go through this. Thank you, Bill.
All right, we ready to go to a break?
Are we ready? I'm sorry.
That was it.
I saw hand motions.
I know.
I didn't know exactly what you were doing.
Let's do it.
So we're going to take a break because this has been fun and come back and talk a little bit more. We'll talk tariffs. We'll do a segment on tariffs. How sexy and exciting is that?
Awesome. Let's go.
Hang on. We'll be right back with a sit down with Russ Latino right here on MPB Think Radio.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bobby Rush. As a blues man, I love Mississippi Public Broadcasting. If you support Mississippi music and their local programming, donate now, right now, and become a member today, not tomorrow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Doesn't matter how big or small, but we prefer big. Thank you very much.
Dr. Susan Buttress asks the hard questions on Southern Remedy, Relatively Speaking.
Can you forgive anyone, anytime, for anything? Do we know how to have a healthy relationship? Have you heard this statement, who am I to judge? Have we taken a hard look at what we're doing as adults? Are you feeling happy?
Find out our answers to these questions by listening to the Southern Remedy, Relatively Speaking podcasts, or listen live, Tuesdays at 11 on MPB Think Radio.
The Measuring Show.
Since 1970, MPB has been enriching the lives of Mississippians.
Everything we do gives us the chance to grow and learn.
With your support, we are always there whenever and wherever you need us. Together through the years, together in the future. Please consider making a donation at mpbfoundation.org. MPB, your stories, our mission.
You're listening to Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. We talked a little bit today about the legislative session, big important deadline yesterday, more big important deadlines next week for floor action. We're talking in depth about the president's speech to the joint session of Congress. One of the things I'd say is if you looked at sort of the fast polling that occurred after the speech, 7 out of 10 of Americans who watched the speech said they felt at least somewhat positive about the speech, which probably means that it went well for President Trump by and large. certainly from today's callers, you're going to have people who are grundled and disgruntled and people who are somewhere in between. We value those calls because I think it's always good to hear the perspective of different people, right? There's always real value in that. I would just say on this Russia-Ukraine thing this. I think that Vladimir Putin is a bad dude, right? I don't think he can be trusted based on the track record. I think there's a lot of misinformation flying around out there about what provoked this. As an example, there's a lot of conversation around whether or not NATO expansion was what provoked this. If you look at what happened at the fall of the Cold War, or at the end of the Cold War, what was promised to Gorbachev was not that NATO wouldn't expand. What was promised to Gorbachev, and he said this, was that during unification of Germany, when the Berlin Wall fell down and Eastern Germany became part of Western Germany, that only German troops would occupy Eastern Germany was the deal. And somehow that got translated into there will never be NATO expansion eastward. If NATO expansion eastward, though, was the problem, then the vast majority of NATO expansion occurred in 1999 and 2004. What really precipitated this is that in 2014, the president of Ukraine decided that he was going to nix a trade deal with the European Union. And because of that, the Ukrainian parliament and the Ukrainian people ousted him. And Russia viewed the ousting of someone from the Ukrainian presidency who was pro-Russia as an affront. And because of that, they occupied Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. And that's what kicked off 10 years of conflict. But it's important to know that between 2010 and the invasion of Crimea by Russia, Ukraine had never applied to be in NATO. In fact, they had said that we will essentially get rid of our desire to be in NATO in order to preserve peace until after Crimea was invaded. And then they changed their point of view that they needed NATO's protection. The other thing to know about this is that Ukraine in 1994 agreed to get rid of all of their nuclear weapons as part of a deal with the U.S., Russia, and the U.K. They had the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. They agreed to get rid of them in exchange for a security guarantee from those three countries. And so a lot of American aid to Ukraine could be argued is a byproduct of an agreement that was made for Ukraine to do away with its own weaponry and denuclearize. There's a lot of complexity to this subject, but also a lot of misinformation flying around. One of those pieces of misinformation is the scale to which the U.S. is supporting Ukraine. So the number that's been used several times by the president is over $300 billion. Congress appropriated $183 billion in aid. About 113 of that has been sent to Ukraine. Half of that 113 was sent in the form of weapons. So if you're talking about actual dollars flowing to Ukraine, it's about $60 billion, which is still a lot of money, but it's not $385 billion. So these are all things that I think are factoring into the debate. Let me say in the couple minutes that we've got around tariffs, a couple of things. The historic conservative position on tariffs is that tariffs hurt economies. They are a tax on consumers. They slow down economic growth. So people don't understand how tariffs work. When Walmart orders a set of televisions from China, China does not write the United States, the nation of China does not write the nation of the United States a check for tariffs. The importer, Walmart, writes a check to the United States government. And then, because they had to write that check to the United States government, they pass on the cost of writing that check to the United States government to consumers in the U.S. So when we're talking about tariffs, what we're really talking about is a de facto sales tax on U.S. citizens. Now, the arguments have been this. One, that it's a negotiation tactic to get better trade deals with these other countries. That may very well be true. The United States has more cushion, if you will, to weather a trade war than most of these other countries. They need us more than we need them. That doesn't mean there won't be pain in the form of higher prices. Two, there's an argument that it raises revenue. I know there was a conversation or has been a conversation about the potential of trillions of dollars of revenue. To give you a point of perspective, the United States gathered about $81 billion total in tariffs last year. So the idea that you're going to massively increase revenue through tariffs, in order to do that, the tariffs would have to be way bigger than anything that's being discussed. The other argument is that it allows American companies to compete with overseas companies who supply cheaper goods. The best example I can give you this is steel tariffs, right? Both Bush and President Trump implemented steel tariffs, and both Obama and Biden at some level have allowed those tariffs to persist, right? So that actually helped U.S. steel companies. It did, there's no doubt, because then they could produce steel at a higher price. Because they inflated the price of their foreign competitors, they still were a better deal, right? The consequence, though, is for every manufacturer that relies on steel, every car plant like Nissan and Toyota in Mississippi that rely on steel saw their cost go up. So the bigger consequence is, yes, the steel industry got helped, but a much larger segment of our economy got hurt. And one of the things you need to understand is that 1/3 of all component parts that go into U.S. manufactured products come from overseas. There's a real risk at play here if this plays out for a long period of time, that it slows down our economy. This hour went too fast. I want to talk more about the sexy policy that is tariffs. But alas, we're out of time. You've been listening to Sit Down with Russ Latino. Thanks for everybody calling in. For Germaine Flood, for the live stream, Abram Nanny in the booth. Tune in next week at 10 a.m. With Speaker of the House Jason White. We'll see Southern Remedy right after this. Have a good one.